Now, we're going to show you another failure of Russian troops near the Vuhledar town in Ukraine. A column of 6 Russian tanks and 1 infantry fighting vehicle began an attack on Ukrainian positions. The Ukrainian troops let them approach the edge of the town, where they ambushed them with javelin missiles. When the tanks approached the right distance, the Ukrainian troops opened fire. The first tank was immediately knocked out of the game. Then the Ukrainians destroyed another tank. And then one more. The armored vehicle pushed forward, but was also hit by a Ukrainian missile. The Russians are forced to abandon their vehicle as it catches fire. They press their heads to the ground, expecting the vehicle to explode. Perhaps it is full of ammunition. Then the Ukrainians began to hunt down the remaining tanks. One of the tanks noticed the Ukrainian troops' ambush and began shooting at them while retreating. Unfortunately, the Ukrainians missed the tank this time. Meanwhile, the previously hit tank spectacularly exploded from the detonation of the shells. Almost nothing was left of the tank except for scraps of metal. The abandoned Russian armored vehicle burned for a long time, but eventually exploded as well. In fact, the Ukrainians halted a major Russian offensive. This infuriates the Russians, and they call for the help of the most fierce artillery, the Sonchepek MLRS. All of this happens quickly, and within a few minutes, dangerous missiles rain down on the Ukrainian positions. Russian commanders often make emotional, impulsive decisions. At this moment, they spare no ammunition, even though they are already experiencing a shortage of them on the front lines. Let's hope that the Ukrainian soldiers were able to escape from there. The next day, the Ukrainians destroyed 2 more Russian tanks. One of the tanks was hit by a javelin missile and soon caught fire. The second tank spotted the Ukrainian position and decided to attack it. But it also received a hit from an anti-tank missile. In the video, you can see some part of it flying off in a spiral trajectory, but the tank continued moving, increasing its speed until it hit a mine on the road. Javelin missiles continued to provide invaluable assistance to the Ukrainians in repelling attacks, and the Russians are still unable to resist them. And here's my favorite case of using a javelin missile. A Ukrainian soldier let 2 Russian tanks pass by and then came out of hiding behind them and destroyed them. This is a true guerrilla warfare. Here are a few more accurate hits on Russian armored vehicles. A camera installed on a Russian tank captured the moment when a tank ahead of it was destroyed by a Ukrainian javelin missile. Currently, Ukrainian soldiers have more of these missiles. Sometimes Ukrainian forces even use them when they are not needed. For example, we see a Russian tank that is already disabled, but Ukrainians fired another javelin missile at it, probably to finish it off. Ukrainian forces also use another type of anti-tank missiles. 2 American town missiles installed on the Humvee armored vehicle have proven to be very effective. They never miss. The Ukrainians use British Brimstone missiles to target important Russian military equipment. These missiles are several times more powerful than javelin missiles and can be launched from a regular civilian truck, and they hit their targets very accurately. The video captured the destruction of a Russian Tu-S-3 howitzer that exploded along with its ammunition. Here's another video showing the destruction of another howitzer somewhere on the southern front that also exploded with its ammunition. Brimstone missiles are well suited for targeting clusters of enemy equipment. Last year, Ukrainian forces destroyed a lot of Russian military vehicles using these missiles. 6 months ago, Ukrainian soldiers typically use Javelin or NLAW anti-tank missiles to destroy Russian tanks. We've witnessed numerous epic scenes of Russian tanks having their turrets blown off, soaring high into the sky, and tanks being torn into pieces of scrap metal. But very soon, it became clear that the Javelin missile was not the best way to destroy tanks. There are far better and cheaper methods. Nowadays, we see that a small kamikaze drone equipped with a grenade poses a much greater threat to tanks and any armored vehicles. Today, I will show you real examples of how Ukraine is completely changing the perception of modern warfare. During the counteroffensive, Ukrainian forces began experiencing a severe shortage of Javelin anti-tank missiles. But it turned out that lightweight FPV, first-person view drones, can completely replace Javelin anti-tank missiles. Here's how it works. Let's compare the operation of the Javelin missile with that of the kamikaze drone. Previously, to destroy a tank, it had to be within your line of sight, meaning you had to see it with your own eyes. The Javelin missile has a special direct guidance optical system. Upon spotting an enemy tank, you could press the launch button and the missile would fly straight toward the target. Now, a tank can be detected using a small drone while remaining in concealment. The tank can be far away from you and not necessarily within your line of sight. It can maneuver behind trees, hills, or between buildings on urban streets. With the help of a drone, you can spot the tank while staying in cover, and using special goggles and a joystick, you can direct your drone straight towards the tank and damage it. You can attach a 1.5 kilogram grenade to such a drone and inflict significant damage to the tank or any armored vehicle. Moreover, you can precisely target the drone at the tank's vulnerable spots, such as its fuel tank. Subsequently, Russians often abandon their armored vehicles and flee. If the opportunity arises, the damaged tank can be captured as a trophy and later repaired. If it's not possible to take it as a trophy, the tank can be destroyed using another drone. For this purpose, there are so-called drone bombers that carry multiple grenades of different types. The drone bomber, releasing one or several grenades into the tank's turret hatch, can eliminate the tank. In such a case, the destruction of the tank can cost a maximum of $1,000, considering the cost of the FPV kamikaze drone and the grenades. Meanwhile, a Javelin missile costs at least $80,000, and sometimes even as much as $100,000. Furthermore, a significant advantage of FPV drones is that they can reach a tank even in challenging conditions when it is not within your line of sight. Indeed, another advantage of drones is that they can infiltrate enemy fortified bunkers through small openings. Exactly, while such bunkers may withstand direct hits from tank shells, enemy soldiers would have no effective means to defend against a small kamikaze drone entering through a window. Drones can exploit these vulnerabilities and pose a significant threat to enemy forces within fortified positions. It must also be noted that despite Ukrainians inventing this tactic, the Russians actively employ it as well. Furthermore, in some sections of the front lines, the Russians use a significantly larger number of kamikaze drones than the Ukrainians. Despite various sanctions, Russians still have access to the most advanced Western technologies. By the way, the Russians are also showing ingenuity. They realize that it's more cost-effective to use the Kornet anti-tank missiles in defense rather than tanks. Previously, while actively defending, the Russians extensively used tanks to repel attacks from Ukrainian forces. In this video, you can see a Russian tank that got blown up by a mine. Its torn track is evidence of that. The tank crew hastily abandons their tank, taking only the most valuable belongings. Just a few minutes ago, this tank was returning to the rear after completing a combat mission when it was hit by a Russian mine. However, the mines were not camouflaged. We can even see them from above. We have another video taken from a different angle where it is also evident that mines are placed on the road, but the crew's still driving forward. They abandon their tank, and the Ukrainians destroy it shortly afterward with an anti-tank missile. Similar situations often occur with Russian tank crews. After the battle, they return to their original positions and get blown up by their own mines. Typically, they abandon their tanks and flee, and the Ukrainians destroy them. By the way, pay attention. In this video, you can clearly see the flight of an anti-tank missile. It's most likely a Javelin. But Ukrainian forces also occasionally fall into mine traps. the Ukrainian armored personnel carrier arrived to pick up soldiers from the front lines for rotation. However, when it was returning and crossing the road, it got hit by a mine. There might have been multiple mines there, judging by the intensity of the explosion. In this video footage, the Russians were launching a counterattack, but ended up losing all their tanks to the mine barrier set up by Ukrainian soldiers. The front line is so saturated with mines that neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians can advance quickly. The Russians have mined vast areas, dug numerous trenches, and filled them with personnel. However, the United States plans to provide the Ukrainian army with cluster munitions. These projectiles can more efficiently target enemy personnel and lightly armored vehicles over larger areas. This will fundamentally change the situation on the front line and allow the Ukrainians to advance much faster. Ukrainian forces are increasingly using the HIMARS and M270 rocket launchers to directly destroy Russian military equipment. Aerial reconnaissance has located 2 Russian BM-21 Grad rocket artillery systems. They will now be destroyed by a HIMARS missile. Just a reminder, the Russian BM-21 Grad is the most common multiple rocket launcher system in the Russian army. So, the HIMARS delivers a missile strike. The Grad BM is destroyed. It's on fire, and then all its projectiles explode. The second HIMARS missile destroyed another Grad BM launcher. Another Grad BM launcher was detected nearby and also destroyed by a HIMARS missile. This is a routine and daily practice. Here's another Grad launcher, and once again the HIMARS missile hits its target. And now we have a large caliber target. A Russian self-propelled howitzer, the Tu-S-19, is hiding among the trees. However, the HIMARS missile destroys it. Another Tu-S-19 self-propelled howitzer is destroyed by a HIMARS missile. The Russian self-propelled artillery system Tornado is also positioned amidst the green trees. By the most conservative estimates, Ukraine has already lost more than 200 units of armored vehicles since the start of the counteroffensive, including Leopard tanks and Bradley infantry fighting vehicles. Ukrainian forces have been attempting to break through the Russian defense for over 2 months now, but they have not been able to advance a significant distance. The objective of this counteroffensive was to cut off the so-called land corridor to Crimea and push Russian forces out of the south of Ukraine as much as possible. However, many have begun to feel that the Ukrainian counteroffensive has failed, and hopes for Ukraine's success have diminished. Today, I will tell and show you what is actually happening on the front lines. Why is Ukraine advancing so slowly, and what difficulties is the Ukrainian army facing? We will also answer the main question: when will the Russian defense finally be breached? And will the Ukrainian forces be able to reach the Azov Sea, thereby cutting off the land corridor to Crimea? So first and foremost, the biggest obstacle in the path of the Ukrainian forces has been minefields. The Russians have mined almost all spaces, roads, road shoulders, fields, plantations, and everything else. They have used tens of thousands of tons of anti-tank mines. It is precisely because of the minefields that Ukrainians are suffering the greatest losses in armored vehicles and tanks. Most of the videos showing destroyed Ukrainian military equipment that you have seen on the internet are mainly due to these minefields. Additionally, even trenches are mined by the Russians after retreating, and when Ukrainian soldiers occupy them, the Russians remotely detonate the mines. To give you an idea of how heavily mined the Ukrainian territory is, let me provide you with one fact. According to calculations by international organizations, the post-war demining of Ukrainian once-occupied territories could take over 50 years and cost around $47 billion. Currently, Ukraine is the most heavily mined country on our planet. Mines are scattered everywhere here, from small anti-personnel mines to large anti-tank ones. The Russians have placed so many minefields along the entire front line that sometimes they end up triggering their own mines. Several such incidents have already been documented, and one of them is shown in this video. As it turned out later, Ukrainian forces can easily overcome the most fortified Russian positions. For example, with the help of HIMARS missiles, even concrete bunkers can be destroyed. However, it is very challenging to overcome the minefields. Ukrainians are facing a severe shortage of demining equipment. It has come to the point where they have to use small drone bombers to clear the roads for the passage of armored vehicles. The second serious problem that the Ukrainian forces have encountered is the Russian drones called Lancet. The Lancet is a loitering munition. It can stay in the air for a long time in a loitering mode and carry up to 5 kilograms of explosives, including thermobaric warheads. The explosion of such a munition can cause significant damage to any military equipment and even completely destroy it. Take a look at these video frames. The Lancet drones are destroying a significant portion of Ukrainian armored vehicles, even more than the minefields. In this video, you can see how the Lance drones destroy Ukrainian Leopard 2 tanks and Bradley infantry fighting vehicles. And in this video, we witness the destruction of an even more valuable weapon, the Norwegian NASAMS surface-to-air missile system, which was supplied to Ukraine by Western countries. This is a very painful loss for the Ukrainian army, considering the fact that Russia daily bombards Ukraine with missiles, causing significant damage to civilian infrastructure. Today is a successful day for the HIMARS rocket artillery team. Together with aerial reconnaissance, they will launch a series of missile strikes and destroy numerous Russian artillery systems. But before that, I want to show you how successfully Ukrainian forces destroy Russian tanks. There was a shootout near the Kherson Bridge between Ukrainian and Russian forces. The Russians sent a tank against the Ukrainians to destroy a machine gun nest, but the tank managed to fire only one shot. Then, the Ukrainians delivered a precise strike on it with an FPV drone. In fear, the crew of the Russian tank lost control and veered into a ditch, hitting an electric pole. The crew abandoned the tank and fled. Ukrainians have realized that it is much cheaper to destroy Russian armored vehicles using small FPV drones rather than using expensive Javelin missiles. This Russian armored transporter was disabled by an FPV drone, and then another grenade was thrown at it. As a result, it exploded and was destroyed. The crew of this armored transporter, upon seeing the drone, decided to turn back but hit a mine and exploded. The Russians are getting a persistent fear of Ukrainian drones. Destroying a tank with a Javelin missile may look epic, but it cost at least $80,000. An FPV drone cost around $500. Here's an example of how this tactic works. An FPV drone disabled a Russian tank from behind. Of course, the tank is not destroyed, but it is damaged. We see how the Russians abandoned this tank. And then the Ukrainians finished it off by dropping a grenade on it. Typically, such tanks are no longer usable. Later on, these tanks can still be used for spare parts for Ukrainian tanks if they haven't been completely burned out. But for now, the Russians have concentrated all their forces to surround the Bakhmut city. They are attacking it from the north and south, trying to cut off supplies to the Ukrainian troops. Enemy tanks are trying to break into the city, but the Ukrainian artillery is not sleeping. An Excalibur projectile accurately destroyed a moving Russian tank. Later, another tank is destroyed while trying to enter the city. Ukrainian artillerymen ruthlessly destroy enemy vehicles. Anything marked with the letter Z must be destroyed and burned by any means necessary. The Russians can barely break into Bakhmut with armored vehicles. Therefore, they rely on the infantry and constantly send them into assaults. Against them, the Ukrainians mainly use 60 and 80 caliber mortars. This is the most effective weapon against the advancing infantry. Fire adjustment is conducted from a hidden observation post. Each successful hit brings joy to the Ukrainian commanders. Mortars almost never stop in Bakhmut. On the eastern side, the fighting is already taking place directly on the streets of the city. The enemy is trying to occupy the buildings and turn them into strongholds. Once peaceful houses become a battlefield. Ukrainians have to fight for every street, for every house. The most difficult thing is to knock the enemy out of the buildings. To do this, you have to use a large caliber machine gun. And in the most difficult situations, only tanks can help. The Russians are not afraid to use fighter jets, knowing that the Ukrainians can easily shoot down their planes. In these footage, you can see a downed Russian Su-25 on fire. The pilot ejected and parachuted down to ground. Ukrainians also actively use aviation, Mi-8 helicopters. But the main striking force is still artillery. The Russian troops try to destroy the most valuable Ukrainian M777 howitzers by attacking them with Lancet kamikaze drones, and they often succeed. Sometimes, the Lancet hits projectiles near the howitzer. In this video, we see how a Ukrainian soldier is trying to save shells from detonation. Dangerous, but necessary work. The M777 howitzer can still be repaired, but the shells cannot. Exploding, they can do more damage than a Russian drone. In order to protect the howitzers, the Ukrainians cover them with such nets. The Russians also use the Lancet drones to destroy other important Ukrainian weapons, such as the Stormer HVM air defense system. But Ukrainians also have kamikaze drones. On this video footage, you can see how they are used on enemy armored vehicles. Tank destroyed too. And on this video, Ukrainian drones tracked down and destroyed 2 Russian air defense systems. The Ukrainian army continues its offensive. Ukrainians are exerting immense pressure on the Russian defense line through concentrated artillery fire from all types of guns, ranging from the smallest to the largest. Take a look at how skillfully and accurately the Ukrainian forces are using precision-guided munitions like the Excalibur. Today, I'll show you the best moments of the combat actions. In this video, you can see a Russian self-propelled howitzer 2S9 taking position in a forested area. The Ukrainian forces noticed it and delivered a precise strike with just a single projectile. It resulted in a massive explosion since the ammunition detonated along with the howitzer. The Russian tank attempted to hide from the Ukrainian artillery behind the trees, but the Ukrainian reconnaissance spotted its location. A precision strike with an Excalibur guided projectile was launched against the tank. The result is evident. Here's another instance where a Russian modern tank, the T-90, was detected by Ukrainian aerial reconnaissance. It was targeted with an Excalibur projectile and destroyed. Additionally, the Excalibur projectile destroys numerous Russian artillery systems like the 2S-19 and Grad BM-1, as well as multiple ammunition depots hidden by the Russians in abandoned houses and gardens. Watch how the projectiles explode and scatter in different directions. The Excalibur is a highly advanced 155mm caliber projectile equipped with GPS guidance and can be fired from almost any NATO standard 155mm howitzer. It is evident that in preparation for the offensive, the Ukrainian army has stockpiled a sufficient number of such projectiles to destroy hundreds or even thousands of units of Russian equipment. Economically, this is also a favorable exchange. The cost of a single projectile is approximately $100,000, whereas it can destroy a tank worth $3 million or other significant Russian equipment. Interestingly, the Russians do not possess such highly accurate artillery capabilities. As a result, in order to hit a target, the Russians have to use hundreds of projectiles and old 40-year-old howitzers or resort to multiple rocket launch systems. Consequently, the Russians will sooner or later experience a severe shortage of ammunition. In their attempts to halt the Ukrainian offensive, the Russians are conducting clumsy counterattacks, but they are losing even more armored vehicles. The Russians are repelling tank attacks using RPGs. The camera on a Ukrainian tank captured the moment when an anti-tank grenade flew past the tank. A minute later, another grenade struck the tank. Here are 2 Russian tanks that ventured out for a counterattack, but the Ukrainians destroyed one of the tanks with a precise hit from an anti-tank missile. Shortly after, another tank was destroyed. crew couldn't control the tank and sent it into a ditch. Later, the tank exploded and turned it into scrap metal. On another front segment, the Russians attacked Ukrainian positions with the assistance of 3 tanks. However, under the pressure of Ukrainian artillery, all 3 tanks were damaged. One of the tanks had its turret blown off, as is typical with Russian tanks. By the way, this is a significant difference between German tanks and Russian tanks. For instance, in this video, you can see how a Russian drone, the Lancet, hit a German Leopard tank and ignited it from the inside. However, the tank's turret wasn't blown off because all its ammunition was stored in a separate compartment. If a Russian tank catches fire with ammunition inside, it will most likely explode. We have witnessed numerous cases where Russian tanks have their turrets blown off. And although the progress is not significant yet, Ukrainian forces destroy a large number of Russian military equipment every day. The Russians have shown video footage of destroyed Ukrainian equipment, including German Leopard tanks and American Bradley armored vehicles. The Russians really did manage to destroy 2 or 3 German tanks, but that is not a significant number considering the intensity of the combat operations. In the same period of time, Ukrainian forces destroyed dozens of Russian tanks. The Russians will never show you their own losses, but we will. First and foremost, Ukrainian forces aim to destroy the most valuable types of Russian weapons that pose the greatest threats. To achieve this, they use precision-guided munitions such as Excalibur. Look at how the Russian BM-21 Grad rocket launcher was accurately hit by an Excalibur projectile. And here's another Grad that was destroyed. It is one of the most common artillery systems in Russia. It turned out that it can be easily destroyed by simply dropping a single grenade on it. The rocket launcher was damaged and started spontaneously launching projectiles. Additionally, the Ukrainians destroyed the Russian Buk M1 surface-to-air missile system with a precise hit. This system provides air cover for Russian fighters and helicopters, making it a valuable element of defense. But now, it is destroyed. Some of the Russian air defense systems refuse to operate at all. And in this video, a Russian TOS multiple rocket launcher system was spotted. The Russians used this dangerous weapon against the advancing Ukrainian infantry. With a single precision-guided projectile, the target was hit and destroyed. Also, the Excalibur projectile can destroy tanks. Look, Ukrainians found 2 Russian M1990 self-propelled howitzers, and 2 accurate hits destroyed them, one by one. Ukrainians brought their skills to the point of art. Ukrainian intelligence noticed a convoy of trucks transporting ammunition to Russian soldiers and opened artillery fire on it. One of the trucks caught fire, causing all the ammunition inside to explode. During the counter-battery warfare, Ukrainians are destroying dozens of Russian artillery systems daily. For example, here is the self-propelled howitzer 2S1 that was hit. Initially, the nearby ammunition caught fire, which then spread to the howitzer itself. After some time, it exploded into small pieces. After successfully repelling the Russian attack, Ukrainian tanks launched a counterattack to reclaim Russian positions. In these videos, we see a Ukrainian tank boldly approach Russian trenches and destroy a fortified position with direct fire. Shortly after, Ukrainian M113 armored personnel carrier opened machine gun fire on Russian infantry. Ukrainian soldiers disembarked and cleared the trenches. It was a successful operation. I found it interesting that Ukrainian tanks often closely approach Russian trenches and shoot at them point blank, and the Russians can do nothing about it. This may mean that they have an acute shortage of anti-tank weapons. Ukrainians are increasingly using tanks in counterattacks. If they need to clear a road of mines before proceeding, they use the American M58 mine clearing system. It's very helpful. However, the Russians continue to send live troops to the front line. Fearing the loss of many tanks, they rely on regular soldiers. Armored vehicles deliver several Russian platoons to the front line and then retreat back. The soldiers capture new positions in the forest, Later, a few more armored vehicles brought in additional assault Russian platoons. Their task is to create and hold fortified positions in this area. However, the Ukrainian aerial reconnaissance is observing everything and knows where to strike. Shortly after, the Ukrainians launch a powerful attack on the Russians using a guided JDAM bomb. Surviving such bombs is almost impossible, as it mixes the soldier with the ground and fire. Meanwhile, the Russians have almost captured the Bakhmut city. They brought tanks and armored vehicles into the city and are squeezing Ukrainian forces out. A Russian tank is firing directly at a Ukrainian position in a multi-story building. Look at the most advanced Russian tank, the T-90M, which is very rare in Russian army, but was brought here for the purpose of filming a news for Russian television. Recently, one of these tanks was discovered in the United States and taken to Louisiana for research purposes. However, the Russian tanks in Bakhmut don't last long. Soon they turn into scrap metal. Also note how the Ukrainian drone drops a bomb on a moving Russian tank. We haven't seen anything like this before. The task of the Ukrainian army here is very simple: to destroy as much Russian tanks and other armored vehicles as possible. Ukrainians have good air reconnaissance and monitor everything that happens. As a result of accurate hits, the Russians are losing more and more. Russian armored vehicles and tanks constantly burn and explode on approach to the city or in the city itself, and Russian fighter aircrafts which still dare to fly around the city also crash and explode. Recently, we have seen several videos of downed Russian planes. Russians often forget they don't have air superiority in Ukraine. On the eastern region of Bakhmut, the Russians have set up a command post in a well-preserved building. They also install radio-electronic reconnaissance antennas in Bakhmut, usually on the top of tall buildings. Ukrainian intelligence learned about this and launched an artillery strike on the command post. The headquarters caught fire, as did all the military equipment nearby. Later, the building was completely engulfed in flames. Then, the building exploded and collapsed, as there were many ammunition inside. The Ukrainians also destroyed reconnaissance systems using kamikaze drones. By the way, using small FPV drones, Ukrainians are inflicting serious damage to Russian troops. Take a look at these video clips. Russians are firing from an armored vehicle when suddenly they get hit by a Ukrainian drone. Another armored personnel carrier also gets hit by a drone, and then another one. There are rumors that Ukrainian forces may use tens of thousands of such drones during the next counteroffensive. Russian soldiers have a habit of creating small weapon depots in civilian houses and then hiding there themselves. Ukrainian artillery constantly strikes at them, leaving them no chance. While retreating, Ukrainians sometimes leave well-fortified multi-story buildings to the Russians. Russian squads occupy the building and set up their positions there, but the building turned out to be secretly mined, and at night, the Ukrainians blew it up along with the Russians. But the Russians have also had successes. Look at the road leading to Bakhmut. The Russians constantly shell it, making it impossible to travel during the day without getting caught in the shelling. The Ukrainians are also losing people and armored vehicles. For example, here is a burning Ukrainian M113 armored personnel carrier. The Russians even managed to capture one of these armored personnel carriers and are now using it, marking it with a letter Z. Also, Russian kamikaze drones called Lancet continue to create many problems. In this video, Lancet destroyed a Polish self-propelled howitzer Crab, which exploded from the detonation of shells. Then it destroyed another howitzer. And when the Russians get angry, they unleash thousands of rocket artillery shells on Ukrainian troop positions. Overall, the Russians are fully preparing for defense. To do this, they blow up bridges so that the Ukrainians cannot pass over them in future counterattacks. So make sure to subscribe to my channel so you don't miss it. Tanks were also employed to destroy enemy strongholds or bunkers. As a result, the Russians depleted a significant portion of their main tank force. After all, tanks are easily detectable and susceptible to destruction due to their size. Additionally, tanks are an expensive asset, with a cost of a Russian T-90 Porov tank reaching up to $3 million. only a few of them remain in the Russian army. Consequently, to preserve their tanks, the Russians started employing the Kornet anti-tank missile system more frequently. With Kornet, they can effectively engage various targets with the same efficiency as tanks. Especially during the summer, when such weapons can be hidden in the green foliage, it's challenging to detect a soldier with a Kornet anti-tank missile system. They can lie in ambush and strike Ukrainian armored vehicles or destroy fortified bunkers at the opportune moment. The destructive power of the Kornet missile is nearly equivalent to that of a tank shell, and its firing range is comparable, reaching up to 5 kilometers. Additionally, the Kornet anti-tank missile can be equipped with a thermobaric warhead. These are the types of munitions that the Russians employ against Ukrainian fortified positions. The differences between a tank and the Kornet system lie in the fact that tanks are much more expensive and easier to lose in battle, whereas the Kornet costs just $1,000 and its detection is highly elusive. The advantages of such tactics are evident. Let's go back to drones again. Recently, Denmark provided Ukraine with special drones for remote mine clearance. These drones can detect metallic objects up to 3 meters deep. Their sensors can detect magnetic anomalies in air, water, and soil. Take a look at these footage. Ukrainian armored vehicles got caught in minefields. As a result, the vehicles were damaged. In the best case, Ukrainians use specialized heavy mine clearing vehicles. However, even they sometimes sustain damage. Soon, these heavy and costly machines will be replaced by drones that can detect mines and destroy them remotely. Moreover, Ukrainians have learned to use even regular drone bombers for demining purposes. If mines block the path, they can be destroyed using such a method, dropping a grenade from a drone onto the mines. The explosion of the grenade triggers the detonation of all the mines on the road, allowing tanks or other armored vehicles to pass through unimpeded. Previously, they used to be detonated by running over the mines. In China and other countries, swarms of drones are used to create impressive aerial shows. For example, in one of the Chinese cities, a swarm of drones transformed into a giant dragon, moving in a remarkably natural manner. These drone swarms are controlled through specialized programs, and the drones can take various forms. Now, imagine if all these drones were carrying ammunition. A swarm of such drones could be programmed to fly over any obstacles on the battlefield and engage pre-programmed targets. Furthermore, if these drone swarms were equipped with special sensors, night vision devices, and thermal imagers, and then trained with artificial intelligence to detect and engage enemy infantry, they would become even more formidable. A swarm of kamikaze drones with these capabilities looks like a swarm of bees, hunting down their targets in unison. It will be impossible to shoot them down with any air defense systems. Moreover, such drones will be capable of infiltrating trenches, bunkers, and anywhere they can fly due to their small size. In the south of Ukraine, over 60,000 Russian soldiers are constantly stationed on the front line, repelling Ukrainian offensives. If Ukraine possessed a swarm of combat drones numbering several tens of thousands, they could potentially eliminate almost all Russian soldiers in a single night. This would be a revolutionary event in modern warfare, and it is the direction in which things are headed. This is how the war of the future will look like. The development of such technologies is already actively taking place in the USA. HIMARS receives the coordinates and delivers a missile strike to that location. And although the missile hit very close, you have no doubt that the target is affected. The destructive power of the M31A1 missile is enormous. The warhead of the missile can impact targets within a radius of up to 150 meters from the point of detonation. Pay attention to this powerful explosion. It's the explosion of a Russian armored personnel carrier. Sometimes, the Russians load explosives into armored vehicles and send them towards Ukrainian positions. However, the Ukrainians detonate them in advance. In this forest plantation, one such armored personnel carrier loaded with explosives was stopped. It caught fire and later exploded. An explosion of such magnitude can destroy a fortified bunker, which is why the Russians use this tactic. Now, here's a unique video. The Russians hastily abandoned the armored vehicle filled with explosives. According to their plan, this armored vehicle was supposed to reach the Ukrainian bunker on its own and detonate it. However, the Ukrainians destroy this armored personnel carrier in advance using an anti-tank missile. Here's another example. A Russian armored personnel carrier was moving towards Ukrainian positions. Ukrainian soldiers fired an anti-tank missile at it. The enormous explosion once again proves that there was a significant amount of explosive material in the vehicle. And here, the Russians loaded an old T-55 tank with 6 tons of TNT. The Ukrainians hit it with a grenade launcher, causing an explosion with an incredible force of the blast wave. Ukrainian artillery is also destroying another important Russian equipment. Reconnaissance has detected the Uragan multiple rocket launcher system. This system launches unguided rockets with significant destructive power. Using the Uragan systems, the Russians daily shell Ukrainian cities near the front lines, causing significant damage to the infrastructure. And with just a single Excalibur projectile, they managed to hit the target and destroy this devastating Russian weapon. And here's the destruction of the 2 S-5 artillery system using a HIMARS missile. The Russians concealed the SA-15 Gauntlet surface-to-air missile system among the trees. It is designed to engage and destroy aerial targets, including aircraft, helicopters, and unmanned aerial vehicles. It is a highly valuable weapon worth up to $10 million. But the Ukrainians tracked its coordinates and destroyed it with just one HIMARS missile. The uncontrolled explosion of ammunition confirms the destruction of the system. It is evident that the Ukrainian army has accumulated enough HIMARS ammunition to actively employ them during their counteroffensive. Currently, the command of the Ukrainian army is focused on destroying as much Russian artillery and other military capabilities as possible, and only then will it be possible to deliver the main strike and break through the Russian defense. One of the main tasks is to destroy as many Russian ammunition as possible, which they typically hide among thickets and trees. Take a look at this video. Ukrainian reconnaissance found a bunch of Russian anti-tank mines among the trees. To destroy it, it was enough to drop one grenade from a drone. The explosion created a crater in the ground, and all the trees burned down. In this video, we can witness the detonation of a large number of ammunition hidden among the trees. Recently, the Ukrainians tracked down a large ammunition depot in abandoned buildings on the outskirts of the city of Donetsk. Another year again, ammunition started exploding and the Grad launcher was destroyed. The Russian artillerymen were assigned to shell Ukrainian positions with the heavy Tornado S multiple rocket launcher. They took positions between the trees, and one of the launchers managed to launch a rocket strike. However, Ukrainian reconnaissance immediately detected them and delivered a precise strike. The first Tornado S launcher started exploding as its rockets began to fly uncontrollably, but the second launcher managed to leave the position in time and avoided destruction. We can see the Ukrainian projectile landing precisely where the Russians were, albeit with a slight delay. Next, the Russian Buk air defense system was discovered among the trees. With a precise hit from a HIMARS missile, it was destroyed. Look at the fireworks and how its projectiles detonate. By the way, Russian anti-aircraft missile systems sometimes attempt to shoot down even small reconnaissance drones. In this video, we see a missile miss and fly past the drone. They don't hesitate to use expensive missiles as Ukrainian reconnaissance guides the HIMARS missiles using these drones. Next, a very valuable exhibit was spotted, the RB-301 electronic warfare complex. A HIMARS missile turned it into unusable scrap metal. Another Grad launcher was also destroyed nearby. 2 more Grad BM-21 launchers were discovered in the bushes at another location. Unfortunately, the first rocket did not destroy the Grad launcher, possibly due to imprecise coordinates, but the second rocket launcher burned the second Grad launcher. Soon, another Grad launcher was discovered and destroyed. Then, a large caliber artillery installation was detected and also destroyed by a HIMARS missile. It burned along with its ammunition. By the way, did you notice this truck? These trucks deliver ammunition to the artillerymen. We have a video where one of these Russian trucks detonates on a mine along with its cargo. And reconnaissance spotted a Russian logistics convoy. Several HIMARS rockets were launched at it, and the convoy was completely incinerated. Reconnaissance discovered another Uragan multiple rocket launcher. The Russians were preparing to launch their rockets, but the HIMARS missile beat them to it. The guys didn't even have time to run away. And nearby, scouts found another Uragan multiple rocket launcher and delivered a precise strike to it. And then another 2S-19 self-propelled howitzer was destroyed. And finally, several field ammunition depots were destroyed. It was a very successful day. Ukrainians destroy enemy armored vehicles with artillery strikes. The Excalibur's unique high-precision guided projectile allows them to destroy tanks with pinpoint accuracy. It is controlled by aerodynamic rudders and uses GPS. In fact, it turns Ukrainian howitzers into large caliber sniper rifles, capable of hitting single targets tens of kilometers away. The Russians can only dream of such accuracy. They don't have high-precision artillery at all. Because of this, they spend more ammo than they need. But most of all, Russians love to use MLRS systems. This is the most indiscriminate weapon ever made. The Bakhmut city and its surroundings look like a landscape after the First World War just because of this type of weapon. Hundreds and thousands of exploding shells destroy houses and trees, mixing everything with the ground. This is how the Russians hope to win, by leaving behind scorched earth. And this is the 2S7 self-propelled howitzer, the most powerful Russian gun. Its 203mm shell is capable of reaching up to 20 miles and causing enormous damage to the enemy. Fortunately, the Russians do not have many of these shells, and then use them not often. Ukrainians actively use the M270 launcher near Bakhmut. It's like doubled HIMARS. Ukrainians hide it in the forest, as it is a very valuable weapon. It has an important role to play, to destroy enemy ammunition depots, command posts, and enemy MLRS systems. Every day, Ukrainians destroy some large Russian depot, as you can see on the footage. On the outskirts of the Bakhmuts, Ukrainian troops defend their positions in trenches. This is a personal video from a Ukrainian soldier. It is the first battle in his life. These guys are taking the brunt of the enemy artillery. Before advancing, the Russians pour tons of artillery shells on them. And then they advance with the supportive mortar fire. Ukrainian soldiers must first survive under artillery strikes, and then repel attacks on their positions. The enemy is trying to cut off the roads that supply the city. They are trying to surround the city and force the Ukrainian troops to leave. Bakhmut is already in a semi-encircled, but as long as there is a road to it, the city can be held. Let me tell you about the road to Bakhmut. Ukrainians call it the Road of Life. Every day and night, Ukrainian troops are supplied along it. And on the way back, they transport the wounded. You can see a lot of destroyed Ukrainian equipment along the Road of Life. This is because the enemy often shells the road. Many vehicles never make it to the city with food supplies, and many of the wounded never made it out. It's one of the saddest places in Ukraine. Sometimes, even the weather complicates life on the front line. Due to the rains, the ground becomes muddy and turns into a swamp. This brings additional moral discomfort to the soldiers. It is especially difficult when water appears in the trenches. Heavy armored vehicles cannot pass through the dirt roads. These roads become an additional challenge for the soldiers. Mud complicates logistics and takes away precious time. As you know, armored vehicles like firm ground. Only then can the army advance quickly and successfully. The Ukrainian command consults every few days on the need to hold Bakhmut. The effectiveness ratio is currently in favor of Ukraine. This means that the enemy is suffering much more losses here than Ukraine. Bakhmut buys time while the main forces of the Ukrainian army prepare for a major counteroffensive. In these video footage, you can see the presumed use of the American high-precision bomb, JDAM, in the Bakhmut city. Several videos have leaked online confirming this. And if it is true, the Russians should definitely worry. The JDAM bomb is dropped from an aircraft and can fly up to 40 miles, hitting the target precisely and causing significant damage to enemy structures. See, for example, how the Americans bombed JDAM in Afghanistan. A small village was wiped off the face of the earth. When the Ukrainian army goes on the counteroffensive, the Russians' fortified positions will also be swept away by this massive fire. Putin needs some kind of victory. Russians hope to capture the city of Bakhmut with great persistence and sacrifices to demonstrate to the world at least some combat capability of the Russian army. But even if the Russians capture the city, it will not bring them any benefit. The fate of this war will soon be decided by the Ukrainian counteroffensive, which we all look forward to. However, to be objective, it must be acknowledged that the Russians also managed to inflict painful losses on the Ukrainian forces. For example, the Russians found and destroyed a Ukrainian Tu-S1 artillery system along with its ammunition. Ukrainian army also suffers significant losses from Russian kamikaze drones like the Lancet. Here's an instance where such a drone destroys a Ukrainian S-300 air defense complex. Here's another such case. These are very painful losses for the Ukrainians. And here, the Lancet destroys Ukrainian armored vehicles. The Lancet is also capable of destroying Ukrainian tanks. In this video, we can see how the Russians tracked a Ukrainian Grad multiple rocket launcher system and destroyed it using the same Lancet drone. Here's the destruction of a Western-made Ukrainian armored vehicle, and logistics vehicles as well. However, in response, the Ukrainians launched massive attacks using FPV drones, destroying even more Russian armored vehicles. I can make a video several hours long, showing the extensive losses of Russian military equipment from the strikes of Ukrainian army drones. The Russians know how dangerous these small Ukrainian drones are and fear them so much. As soon as they spot a Ukrainian drone nearby, they immediately abandon their armored vehicles and flee. The Ukrainian forces have also perfected their aerial reconnaissance on the battlefield. It involves a drone capable of dropping grenades. This weapon should not be underestimated. The drone can locate an ammunition depot and destroy it with just a single grenade. Moreover, the drones are capable of destroying a vast number of armored Russian vehicles. Perhaps no other weapon has destroyed as much armored machinery as the bomber drones. Nothing can compare to this weapon on the front lines of combat. The Russians do not know how to combat drones. They have no solution to this problem. As the Ukrainians advance, they attack Russian positions with the support of tanks. However, during the offensive, the Ukrainians have to clear mines from roads and fields to allow their armored vehicles to pass through. The Russians have created heavily mined areas, and the Ukrainians have to spend a lot of time and effort to breach the minefields. To understand the extent to which the Russians have mined Ukrainian fields and roads, take a look at this video. A Ukrainian armored transporter was returning to the rear, but even there, it encountered a mine and detonated. And even the Russians sometimes fall into their own mines. For example, a Russian tank was returning to its positions and detonated on its own mine. The video clearly shows a minefield nearby. It appears that the tank accidentally drove over one of the mines. The Russians abandoned that tank. Here's another Russian tank that detonated on its own mine. The Russians abandoned the tank and fled the battlefield. The Ukrainian soldiers destroyed the tank using a kamikaze drone. And sometimes, mines behave very deceitfully and unpredictably. In this video, two Ukrainian armored transporters are moving along the road. The first one passed through a mined area unharmed, while the second one detonated on a mine. To clear the passages, Ukrainian forces use specialized demining vehicles. The process itself looks very impressive, but takes a lot of time. Sometimes, demining operations are conducted during offensive operations. It is a complex task that requires a high level of coordination among all units. Ukrainian sapper teams are working in the liberated territories. This is also a very complex job. The discovered Russian mines are collected and then destroyed by detonating them together. Ukrainian generals, led by Mr. Zaholzny, have focused on destroying Russian logistics. They are destroying bridges and ammunition depots belonging to the Russians. Recently, Ukrainian aviation targeted and destroyed a bridge that served as the route for 70% of ammunition supplies to Russian forces. Additionally, Ukrainians systematically destroy Russian fuel reserves and ammunition depots. Several large ammunition storage facilities have been destroyed in the past weeks. Sooner or later, this will have an impact on the Russian strategic defense, and it will be breached. No matter how much military equipment and personnel you have, if you lack ammunition, you will lose. A Russian zoo radar station was noticed nearby. With its help, the Russians were tracking the positions of the Ukrainian artillery. The Ukrainians did not hesitate to use an Excalibur projectile to destroy it with a precise hit. A Russian armored personnel carrier was rushing to aid their forces, but was hit by anti-tank weaponry. It caught fire and subsequently exploded along with the ammunition it carried. Another armored personnel carrier was destroyed by an FPV drone. It likely also carried ammunition inside. Ukrainian soldiers often use such drones to target light armored vehicles as well as tanks. Look at the impeccable work of the Ukrainian artillery personnel. The reconnaissance identified the position of the Russians from where they were conducting howitzer fire. Adjacent to it was a building housing their ammunition depot. The Ukrainians launched just one projectile and hit the depot accurately, causing an immediate explosion. The blast was so powerful that it destroyed the howitzer along with the Russian artillerymen. Not far from here, the Russians positioned a self-propelled howitzer 2S5. As usual, they store ammunition right next to the howitzer among the trees. With the help of two fired projectiles, the Ukrainians hit the enemy howitzer, causing the nearby ammunition to explode. Later, another ammunition depot was found and destroyed. The Russians often hide their ammunition among the trees. Here is another example. Ukrainian intelligence found a pile of shells and dropped only one grenade on them. All Russian shells exploded and left behind a large hole. Then, only one grenade managed to destroy another ammunition depot. The explosion was so strong that it almost took down the drone. The Russians hid their ammunition in a road culvert, but the Ukrainians launched an FPV drone into it. The projectiles caught fire, and within a few seconds, exploded along with the culvert. The road was also damaged in the process. And here, the Russians abandoned the fuel tanker. Just one grenade lifts its contents into the air. One important thing I've realized about the Russian army is that they easily abandon their military equipment and flee from the battlefield when faced with significant resistance. They simply abandon their tanks in the field and run away. It's a myth that Russians fight heroically. Ukrainian forces then have to destroy all this abandoned equipment using bomber drones. If possible, the Ukrainians seize a Russian tank as a trophy and use it against the Russians. This video captured the performance of a Javelin missile. After the attack, the Russian tank retreated under the pressure of Ukrainian artillery. You can see how one tank was hit. And here, it is clearly visible how a Ukrainian soldier launched a Javelin missile from an ambush, which hit a Russian tank. Sometimes, Ukrainian soldiers succumb to excitement. The Russians abandoned an armored vehicle and disappeared. The Ukrainian armed forces soldiers decided to destroy it no matter what. Numerous grenades were dropped until finally, one grenade ignited the armored vehicle, which then burned down. There was another armored personnel carrier nearby, which was filled with ammunition. It took just one grenade to ignite that armored vehicle. The detonation of the projectiles caused the armored personnel carrier to explode. As I mentioned before, Russians easily abandon their armored vehicles as soon as they encounter the slightest threats. The thing is, Russian armored personnel carriers are highly vulnerable. They are well protected on the sides, but not from the top. Just one grenade can penetrate the hatch cover. Therefore, when Russians spot a drone carrying grenades in the sky, they immediately abandon their armored vehicles and flee. Ukrainian soldiers are left with the task of destroying them without facing any resistance. According to the Ukrainian army's data, Russia has already lost over 4,000 of such armored vehicles. 2 more Russian armored personnel carriers were moving to reinforce the position, but fell into an ambush. One of them was hit by an anti-tank grenade, but it continued its movement. Then, we see the second grenade missing its target. Eventually, the Russian armored personnel carriers were halted, and their crews fled the battlefield. As I mentioned in my previous reports, the Russians almost immediately abandoned their armored vehicles when facing danger. Ukrainian drone operators are consistently engaged in destroying this abandoned armor if it is located in the gray zone and cannot be captured as a trophy. The Ukrainian aerial reconnaissance spotted a Russian T-80 tank. A precise artillery shot was fired directly at the rear of the tank, causing it to immediately catch fire. Another tank was spotted nearby and was also hit by an artillery shell. The same fate befell this tank. It caught fire and burned for a long time until its interior was completely consumed. Eventually, the turret of the tank was blown off. Yet another Russian tank was detected and disabled by artillery fire. Like the others, it caught fire and burned out entirely from the inside. An interesting video has surfaced on the internet. Near the burnt tank, Russian soldiers held a funeral procession. They placed a wooden cross right next to the tank and prayed for their fallen comrade. Another soldier fired shots into the air, as is customary among military personnel. Judging by the remains of the disabled tank, you can imagine the magnitude of the explosion and what might have happened to the crew inside the tank. Ukrainian artillery also successfully targeted and hit 2 more S-24 self-propelled howitzers. The first Russian mortar was positioned in a visible and elevated location, making it an easy target for the Ukrainian artillery, which successfully hit and disabled it. To give you an understanding, this mortar system is a highly dangerous weapon. It is equipped with a 240mm caliber gun and can launch projectiles up to a range of 10 kilometers, capable of destroying even heavily fortified bunkers. The next 2S4 mortar launcher was spotted and this is a larger target, the Russian Sanchepek rocket system. I've often told you how dangerous this weapon is. The Russians are using it against the advancing Ukrainian infantry. The operator directed the FPV drone straight into the compartment with rockets, and the rockets began detonating spontaneously. It looked like a massive fiery show. In war, one has to destroy various targets. It is crucial to destroy enemy ammunition depots. Ukraine is very successful in dealing with this. Each destroyed projectile potentially saves a soldier's life. Destroying enemy ammunition means fighting proactively. It's a preemptive move. That's why the Ukrainian command attaches great importance to identifying and destroying enemy ammunition depots. Using FPV drones, Ukrainians conduct full-fledged hunts for Russian tanks. Drones can also be used against infantry in fortified trenches, and even for road clearing from mines. Here's another advantage of conventional drones over other types of weapons. Take a look at this video. They hid a Russian armored transporter behind an industrial building, pressing it tightly to the wall. Ukrainian soldiers are on the other side. In this position, it's impossible to destroy the armored transporter with artillery or an anti-tank missile. However, thanks to a regular drone hovering in the air, we can observe the location of this target, and then a small FPV drone can fly around the corner of the building and strike the armored vehicle. And the cost of such an operation does not exceed $500. Isn't that amazing? Russian forces have also learned to use various types of drones against Ukrainian armored vehicles. Russian drones like Lancet pose a particular threat to Ukrainian troops. They are responsible for destroying the most armored vehicles. In the next episode, I will show you how many losses the Ukrainians suffer from Russian drone attacks and discuss ways to counter them. Ukrainian forces have started advancing and have regained control of another settlement in the south of Ukraine. Russian forces launched a counterattack to halt the advancement of the Ukrainian infantry, but were defeated. Parts of their tanks was destroyed by anti-tank missiles and grenades, while Ukrainian forces used drones to burn another portion of their armored vehicles. The Russian troops fled from the battlefield. In this video, You can see at least 9 units of destroyed Russian armored vehicles. In an attempt to dislodge Ukrainian forces from the settlements, the Russians are using heavy FAB-500 bombs. However, this tactic does not always prove successful. Furthermore, Ukrainian forces have made advancements in several locations, penetrating more than 5 kilometers into Russian defense lines. Take a look at this video posted by the Russians. We can see a Ukrainian armored personnel carrier moving towards the Russian defense and falling into an anti-tank trench. There's also a line of what they call dragon's teeth, which are anti-tank obstacles. This suggests that the Ukrainian forces have come really close to the main line of Russian defense, having overcome minefields. It's interesting to note that the Ukrainian armored personnel carrier isn't encountering any resistance from the Russians here, except for the deep trench. All of this also means that Ukrainian forces will soon be able to break through the final line of Russian defense and enter the open operational space, where they can advance much faster. For nearly 2 months, the Ukrainian army has been navigating through Russian minefields, suffering significant losses of armored vehicles. However, in some places, the Ukrainians managed to breach the first line of defense. Recently, the Russian defense has noticeably weakened due to the significant loss in armored vehicles, artillery, and personnel within the Russian army. Additionally, the Russians have also lost a considerable amount of ammunition as the Ukrainians effectively conducted strikes deep into the enemy's rear, destroying numerous ammunition depots. The Russians are also facing losses in their aviation. In this video, you can witness the destruction of a Russian attack helicopter, the Ka-52 Alligator. One of the crew members in this downed helicopter was Colonel Vitaly Tabaknikov of the Russian aviation. This helicopter is considered the best attack helicopter in Russia, with an estimated cost of around $15 million. According to British intelligence data, the Ukrainian armed forces have successfully shot down more than a quarter of such helicopters. However, the Russian forces still have sufficient resources in the south of Ukraine to repel the counteroffensive. Unwilling to allow the Ukrainians to advance, the Russians are committing all their forces to launch counterattacks. In this video, we can see a Russian tank moving to support the infantry. The tank was spotted and a decision was made to strike it using an FPV drone. Interestingly, after the strike, the tank immediately exploded. Miraculously, one of the crew members survived and managed to escape from the tank. The disabled tank continued to burn for a while until it turned into scrap metal. Later, it was evident that the drone strike caused the tank's ammunition to detonate as the tank's turret was blown up.